The young woman sitting in my salon chair had no idea she was the reason my marriage was falling apart. That was the thought that flashed through my mind the moment she smiled and casually said my husband's name. I didn't react. I didn't drop my scissors or let my surprise show. After 67 years of life, I had learned that the most important truths often arrived quietly. My name is Margaret Sullivan, and 3 months before that afternoon, I had opened the small salon I'd dreamed about for years. It sat on a peaceful corner in a suburban shopping plaza outside Columbus, Ohio, between a bakery and a bookstore. The sign above the door was simple: Sullivan Salon. Nothing fancy, just mine. After decades of putting everyone else first, I finally wanted something that belonged to me. The salon was doing well. Most of my clients were local women who enjoyed conversation as much as a haircut. Emily Parker was different. She was 28, bright, energetic, and always seemed to arrive with a story. She had become one of my regulars within weeks. Every Friday afternoon, she sat in the same chair by the front window while I worked on her hair. That day seemed no different. Sunlight spilled across the floor. Soft music played through the speakers. The scent of shampoo and fresh coffee lingered in the air. Emily laughed as she scrolled through photos on her phone. "You know," she said, "Gregory always says this place feels more welcoming than the expensive salons downtown." My hands froze for the briefest second. Gregory, my husband, the man I had been married to for 42 years, the man who had become strangely distant over the last year. Emily kept talking, completely unaware. "He's always encouraging me," she said. "Honestly, I don't know what I'd do without his advice." I carefully set down my comb. "Gregory?" I asked, keeping my voice light. "Gregory who?" She smiled. "Gregory Sullivan." Then she laughed. "Small world, right?" The room suddenly felt smaller. My pulse quickened, but my expression never changed. Emily continued describing him as if she were talking about someone wonderful, successful, generous, supportive. Every word landed like a pebble, creating ripples across a calm lake. The Gregory she described sounded familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. I thought about the late-night business meetings, the unexplained weekends away, the sudden privacy around his phone. For months, I had dismissed every uneasy feeling. Now a stranger was unknowingly placing puzzle pieces directly into my hands. Emily looked up at me through the mirror. "Have you ever met him?" she asked. I smiled softly and resumed working on her hair. "Yes," I said. "You could say that." She laughed again, never noticing the change in my eyes. Outside, cars moved through the parking lot. Inside, everything looked perfectly normal. But at that moment, I realized I wasn't sitting across from a stranger. I was sitting across from the biggest secret my husband had ever tried to keep. After Emily left that afternoon, I locked the salon an hour earlier than usual. The little bell above the door gave its familiar chime as the last customer disappeared into the parking lot, and suddenly the silence felt heavier than normal. I stood alone beside the reception desk, staring at the appointment book without seeing a single word on the page. Gregory Sullivan, my husband. Emily had spoken his name with such trust, such admiration, that it unsettled me more than anger ever could. During the drive home, I kept replaying every detail of our conversation. The way she smiled when she mentioned him, the confidence in her voice, the certainty that he was helping her build something important. By the time I pulled into my driveway, dusk had settled over the neighborhood. The porch light glowed warmly against the siding of the house where Gregory and I had spent more than 4 decades together. Looking at it, I felt a strange distance, as though I were observing someone else's life. Gregory was already home. His sedan sat in the garage. Through the kitchen window, I could see him standing at the counter making coffee. The scene should have felt comforting. Instead, it felt unfamiliar. I walked inside and set my purse on the chair near the door. "How was your day?" he asked casually. The question was ordinary. His tone was ordinary. Everything about the moment was ordinary except me. "Busy," I replied. "The salon is attracting more regular clients." He nodded without much interest. That alone was not unusual. Gregory had never understood why opening the salon mattered so much to me. To him, it was a hobby. To me, it was proof that life could still begin again at 67. We ate dinner together in relative silence. The evening news played softly from the television in the living room. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows. I watched Gregory as he read something on his phone between bites of food. Every few minutes, The corners of his mouth lifted slightly, as though he were reading messages that pleased him. Before, I would have ignored it. That night, I noticed everything. The screen angled away from me. The quick lock of the device whenever I looked in his direction. The distracted answers. The absence behind his eyes. Later, after he went upstairs, I remained alone at the kitchen table. A mug of tea cooled untouched beside me. The clock above the refrigerator ticked steadily through the quiet house. For months, I had convinced myself that the growing distance between us was simply age, routine, or stress. Now I was no longer certain. Emily had not sounded like someone describing a business acquaintance. She had sounded like someone who trusted him completely. And for the first time in a very long while, I stopped asking whether something was wrong. Instead, I began asking a different question. How much had been happening right in front of me without my noticing it? The next Friday, Emily arrived right on schedule. The autumn air carried a chill, and she hurried into the salon wearing a cream-colored coat and carrying a large tote bag stuffed with folders. The bell above the door chimed softly. She greeted me with the same bright smile she always wore, completely unaware that our last conversation had changed everything for me. I welcomed her in, draped the styling cape around her shoulders, and began preparing my tools. For a few minutes, we spoke about ordinary things. The weather, a new coffee shop that had opened down the street, a local charity event. Then, just as before, the conversation drifted toward Gregory. This time, I listened more carefully. I honestly would not be where I am without his guidance, Emily said as she looked at her reflection in the mirror. When my business struggled last year, he helped me stay focused. I nodded but said nothing. He believes in me more than anyone, she continued. There was sincerity in her voice. Not excitement. Not admiration in the way a person might speak about a celebrity. It sounded more like trust. Deep trust. The kind that takes time to build. I carefully trimmed a section of her hair and watched her expression in the mirror. Emily seemed relaxed, comfortable, safe. Whatever relationship existed between her and Gregory, she clearly believed it was built on honesty. That realization unsettled me more than anything else. Over the next hour, pieces of information slipped into the conversation naturally. Emily mentioned meetings, financial advice, business opportunities. None of it sounded improper. In fact, it sounded remarkably professional. Yet something about it felt incomplete, like reading every chapter of a book except the final one. You know, Emily said suddenly, Gregory keeps telling me I need to think bigger. He says I underestimate what I can accomplish. I smiled politely. And do you believe him? She laughed softly. Most days, yes. Then she paused. Although lately he has seemed stressed, distracted. My hand slowed slightly. Really, it is probably work, she said. But he has canceled several meetings recently. That is unusual for him. I stared at the mirror for a moment. Gregory had also been distant at home. More withdrawn. More secretive. The timing was impossible to ignore. When the appointment ended, Emily gathered her things and prepared to leave. As she lifted her tote bag, several papers slipped onto the floor. Instinctively, I bent down to help. Most were ordinary documents. Invoices, marketing materials, business notes. But one page caught my attention. At the top was the name of a limited liability company I had never seen before. Beneath it was a signature line, Gregory Sullivan. Emily quickly collected the papers and thanked me. A few minutes later, she was gone. I stood alone near the front window watching her drive away. Then I turned and looked back toward the empty salon. For the second week in a row, I felt the same quiet certainty settling over me. Emily was not hiding anything. She genuinely believed she was building a future. The question that would not leave me alone was far more troubling. Why was my husband building it with her? That evening, I sat alone in the den with my laptop open and a yellow notepad beside me. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Gregory was upstairs in his study, supposedly reviewing business reports. A year ago, I would have accepted that explanation without question. Now every routine detail seemed to deserve a second look. I could not stop thinking about the company name I had seen on Emily's paperwork. It had sounded unfamiliar, yet something about it lingered in my mind. After a few minutes of searching public business records online, I found it. The company was real, registered 18 months earlier. What caught my attention was not the business itself, but the names attached to it. Emily Parker appeared as the managing member. Gregory Sullivan was listed on several related filings connected to consulting agreements. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. Nothing I found suggested wrongdoing. Everything appeared legal, organized, professional. Yet the timing troubled me. 18 months ago was roughly when Gregory had begun changing. That was when the unexplained meetings started. The sudden business trips. The private phone calls taken outside on the patio. One memory after another surfaced. Small moments I had ignored because they seemed too insignificant to matter. A canceled anniversary dinner because of an urgent meeting. A weekend conference that somehow produced no photographs. A credit card charge from a restaurant 2 hours away that he claimed must have been a billing error. Individually, each incident had been easy to dismiss. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. Around 9 o'clock, Gregory came downstairs. He walked into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water. I watched him from the doorway. His movements were familiar, comfortable, ordinary. Yet for the first time in 42 years, I felt as though I was looking at someone I did not fully know. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Of course," I replied. He nodded and returned upstairs. The exchange lasted less than 10 seconds. Still, something about it unsettled me. There was no curiosity in his voice, no effort to connect. It was as though we had become polite neighbors sharing the same address. The next morning, I arrived at the salon early. The sky was gray, and a light rain streaked the front windows. Before opening, I brewed coffee and reviewed everything I had discovered. The more I examined the information, the more one fact stood out. Emily seemed deeply involved in the business structure Gregory had helped create, yet she spoke about him with complete confidence. She trusted him. She believed he was helping her succeed. That trust felt genuine. It did not feel manipulated from her perspective, which raised a troubling possibility. What if Emily knew only part of the story? What if she believed she was building her own future while unknowingly helping Gregory build something entirely different? I folded my notes and placed them inside my purse. For weeks, I had been reacting to clues, quietly observing, quietly listening. But as the rain tapped against the glass and the first customers of the day began arriving, I realized something had changed. I was no longer trying to understand whether there was a secret. I was trying to understand how large it really was. 3 days later, an unexpected opportunity arrived. Emily called the salon and asked whether I had time for a private appointment after closing. Her voice sounded tired. Not upset exactly, but weighed down by something she could not quite name. I told her to come by at 6. When she arrived that evening, the parking lot was nearly empty. The bakery next door had already closed, and the streetlights had begun to glow against the darkening sky. Emily settled into the chair near the front window while I prepared a fresh pot of coffee. For a while, neither of us talked about business. We spoke about ordinary things. Family, holidays, childhood memories. The conversation felt surprisingly natural. Then, after several minutes, Emily stared down at the coffee cup in her hands and sighed. "Do you ever get the feeling that something important is happening around you, but nobody is telling you the whole story?" The question caught my attention immediately. I kept my expression calm. "Sometimes," I said. "Why do you ask?" She hesitated. "Because lately I feel like everyone expects me to make decisions without explaining everything." I waited quietly. People often reveal the most when they do not feel pressured. "Gregory keeps telling me to trust the process," she continued. "He says everything is moving exactly as planned. But every time I ask questions, I get vague answers." My pulse quickened. Outwardly, I remained composed. "Questions about what?" Emily looked embarrassed. "Documents, agreements, business structures, things I thought I understood." She shook her head lightly. "Maybe I am overthinking it." I did not believe she was. The uncertainty in her voice sounded genuine. For the first time, I saw small cracks forming in the confidence she had always shown whenever Gregory's name came up. "Trust is important," I said carefully. "But understanding is important too." She nodded slowly. "That is exactly how I feel." The conversation drifted to other topics, but my mind remained focused on those few sentences. When Emily finally left, I locked the salon doors and stood alone in the quiet room. The reflection staring back at me from the dark window looked different than it had a month earlier. Not stronger, not weaker, simply more awake. The next afternoon, another piece of the puzzle appeared. Gregory returned home carrying a folder he rarely allowed out of his office. While he was taking a phone call in the backyard, the folder sat unattended on the kitchen counter. I had no intention of opening it. Then a single page partially slipped free. One familiar name immediately caught my eye. Emily Parker. Beneath her name were references to multiple properties and financial accounts connected to companies I had never heard of before. My stomach tightened, not because I finally had answers, but because I suddenly realized how many questions remained. Emily was involved far more deeply than she understood. And if Gregory had been keeping all of this hidden from both of us, then whatever he was building was much larger than I had imagined. For the next several days, I carried the weight of what I had seen without telling anyone. I went through my normal routine. I opened the salon each morning. I greeted customers with a smile. I swept hair from the floor and brewed fresh coffee. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inside, however, every piece of information was slowly finding its place. The more I thought about Emily, the more convinced I became that she was not intentionally hiding anything. She reminded me of someone building a house without realizing the foundation belonged to another person. One Thursday afternoon, she arrived for an appointment she had scheduled weeks earlier. The moment she walked through the door, I noticed a difference. The confidence she usually carried seemed diminished. Her smile appeared forced. Her eyes looked tired. After I settled her into the chair, neither of us spoke much at first. Soft music drifted through the salon while rain tapped against the windows. Finally, Emily broke the silence. Have you ever trusted someone completely and then started wondering if you missed something important? I looked at her reflection in the mirror. Yes, I answered honestly. She stared down at her hands. I feel foolish lately. I waited. There are documents I signed months ago that I barely remember reviewing. Gregory always explained everything so clearly. At least I thought he did. She laughed nervously. Now I am beginning to realize I might not have understood as much as I believed. My heart sank. Not because I was surprised, but because hearing her say it aloud confirmed what I had suspected. She was beginning to see the gaps herself. What changed? I asked gently. A banker called me this week, she replied. He asked questions about accounts and property records. Nothing alarming. Just routine questions. The problem is that I did not know how to answer them. She shook her head. That should not happen if everything is truly mine, right? I carefully set down my comb. For a few seconds, I considered remaining silent. It would have been easier, safer, but I thought about the confusion in her voice. I thought about the trust she had placed in Gregory. Most of all, I thought about how many months I had spent ignoring uncomfortable truths in my own life. Emily, I said quietly, if you ever feel uncertain about something important, you should ask to see every document yourself. Every page, every signature. She looked up. Do you think I should? I think understanding your own business is never a mistake. She nodded slowly. The conversation ended there, but something had shifted. For the first time, she seemed less interested in trusting Gregory and more interested in verifying what she had been told. After she left, I stood by the front window watching her drive away. A strange mixture of sadness and relief settled over me. Gregory had spent months constructing whatever this arrangement was. Yet the foundation was beginning to crack. Not because anyone was attacking it. Not because anyone was seeking revenge. It was cracking because the people involved were finally starting to ask questions. And sometimes a single honest question can be more powerful than years of carefully protected secrets. The change became visible sooner than I expected. During the following 2 weeks, Emily visited the salon twice, and each time she seemed more focused, more careful, and less willing to accept simple answers. She never mentioned our previous conversation directly, but I could see the difference in the questions she was beginning to ask. One afternoon, she arrived carrying a folder thicker than usual. While I prepared her appointment, she sat quietly flipping through pages covered with notes and highlighted sections. I spent most of the weekend reviewing paperwork, she said. More paperwork than I have looked at in the last year. I smiled gently. Did you find what you were looking for? She hesitated. Not exactly. I found things I did not know I should have been looking for. That answer told me everything. Emily had started examining details instead of relying on explanations. The effect was immediate. Several days later, I noticed Gregory becoming increasingly distracted at home. He checked his phone more often. He stepped outside to take calls he once handled in the kitchen. At dinner, he barely touched his food. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dining room table, his phone buzzed 3 times in less than a minute. Gregory glanced at the screen, frowned, and quickly silenced it. Busy day? I asked. Just business, he replied. The answer came too quickly. I simply nodded and continued eating. For the first time in months, I was no longer searching for clues. The clues were beginning to reveal themselves. A week later, Emily arrived at the salon with an expression I had never seen before. Not fear, not anger, determination. After settling into the chair, she looked at me through the mirror and said, "I asked for copies of everything." My hands paused briefly, and some people were surprised that I asked. Her voice remained calm. Apparently, they were even more surprised when I refused to sign anything new until I reviewed every document myself. I could not help admiring her. The uncertainty that had once defined her was slowly being replaced by confidence. Real confidence. The kind that comes from understanding rather than trusting. "That seems reasonable," I said. Emily gave a small laugh. "You would think so." Then she grew serious. "What is strange is that everyone keeps telling me not to worry. The more they say that, the more I worry." After she left, I stood by the window again and watched her drive away. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Every time Emily asked questions, resistance appeared. Every time she requested clarification, someone tried to reassure her instead of informing her. At home, Gregory seemed increasingly unsettled. At the salon, Emily seemed increasingly aware. Whatever arrangement had existed between them depended on one thing remaining true: Emily trusting without verifying. That condition no longer existed. The structure Gregory had spent so much time building was not collapsing because of conflict. It was weakening because the person he depended on was finally learning the value of seeing things clearly. By the middle of November, the atmosphere around me had changed in ways that were impossible to ignore. The salon remained busy, customers came and went, and the holiday decorations began appearing in store windows throughout the plaza. On the surface, life looked normal. Underneath, however, several carefully hidden pieces were beginning to move. Emily arrived one afternoon carrying far less paperwork than usual. Instead, she carried something else: confidence. It showed in the way she walked through the door and the way she spoke. After settling into the chair, she smiled faintly. "I finally met with my own attorney," she said. "I kept my attention on preparing my tools, but I listened carefully." "How did it go?" I asked. "Better than I expected." She paused. "Apparently there were several things I should have been told a long time ago." My hands remained steady. "That must have been difficult to hear." Emily nodded. "It was. But it was also a relief." She looked at her reflection for a moment. "At least now I know what questions to ask." That single sentence stayed with me long after she left. Knowledge changes people. Once someone understands what they are looking at, confusion loses its power. A few days later, I noticed another change at home. Gregory seemed unusually tense. He spent hours in his study behind a closed door. Several evenings in a row, he skipped dinner entirely, claiming he had urgent work to finish. One night, as I passed the study, I heard his voice through the partially closed door. Not angry, not loud, just strained. The kind of strain that appears when plans stop unfolding as expected. I continued walking without interrupting. There was nothing left for me to investigate. The truth was slowly revealing itself on its own. The following week, Emily returned once again. This time she appeared calmer than I had seen her in months. "Some accounts have been temporarily frozen while everything is reviewed," she said casually. "Nothing dramatic. Just standard procedures." Even so, I noticed something important. She no longer sounded intimidated by the process. She sounded informed. "And how do you feel about that?" I asked. Emily smiled. "Honestly, better." She laughed softly. "For the first time, I know exactly what belongs to me and what does not." As she spoke, I realized how far she had come. The uncertainty that once followed her everywhere was gone. In its place stood someone who trusted her own judgment. Meanwhile, Gregory seemed to be moving in the opposite direction. Every day, he appeared more distracted, more frustrated, more isolated. The contrast was impossible to miss. One person was gaining clarity, the other was losing control. And as Thanksgiving approached, I began sensing that whatever had been hidden for so long was nearing its final moment. Secrets can survive confusion. They can survive silence. What they rarely survive is transparency. And transparency was spreading faster than Gregory realized. The final pieces fell into place on a cold afternoon just a few days before Thanksgiving. The salon was quiet between appointments, and I was organizing product shelves near the reception desk when the bell above the door rang unexpectedly. I looked up and saw Gregory standing in the entrance. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He rarely visited the salon. In fact, since I had opened it, he could count his visits on one hand. Yet there he was, wearing a dark coat and carrying an expression I had not seen in years. Uncertainty. I invited him inside. He declined coffee and remained standing. That alone told me something was wrong. Gregory had always preferred control. Standing instead of sitting felt like a man preparing for a difficult conversation. "We need to talk," he said. His voice sounded tired. Not angry, not confident, simply tired. I nodded and waited. "Emily has been making changes," he continued. "Lawyers are reviewing everything. Accounts are being examined. Projects are delayed." I listened without interrupting. "People are overreacting," he added. "A lot of unnecessary complications are being created." I noticed he never said mistakes had been made. He never said misunderstandings needed clarification. Instead, he spoke only about inconvenience. The distinction mattered. "What exactly do you want from me?" I asked quietly. Gregory looked away toward the front window. Cars passed outside beneath gray November skies. Finally, he sighed. "She trusts you." The words hung in the air between us. Not because they surprised me, but because they confirmed what I had suspected for months. Gregory believed influence belonged to whoever controlled information. He could not imagine trust existing for any other reason. "Emily trusts herself now," I replied. "That is different." He frowned. "You do not understand how much damage this is causing." I looked at him carefully. For years, I had viewed Gregory as the strongest person in every room. Successful, decisive, certain. Standing in my salon that afternoon, he looked smaller than I remembered. Not because he had changed physically, but because the illusion surrounding him had disappeared. "I think I understand perfectly," I said. Silence followed. The kind of silence that arrives when there is nothing left to defend. Gregory eventually nodded once and turned toward the door. Before leaving, he paused. "Did you tell her something?" he asked. I considered the question for a moment. Then I smiled gently. "No." I encouraged her to read what she was signing. He stared at me, and for the first time, I saw genuine recognition in his eyes. Not recognition of defeat, recognition of truth. A few weeks later, Emily stopped by the salon with homemade cookies and an update. Everything had been reviewed. Every agreement had been clarified. Every decision moving forward would be made with full transparency. She seemed lighter, happier, more certain of herself than ever before. After she left, I locked the salon and stood alone beneath the warm glow of the lights. Outside, the first snowflakes of the season drifted through the evening air. I thought about everything that had happened. In the end, nobody needed revenge. Nobody needed dramatic confrontations. The only thing that changed the outcome was understanding. Gregory lost the influence he once relied upon. Emily gained the confidence to protect her own future. And I learned that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is help someone else see clearly. Once that happens, the truth takes care of the rest.